Question 4 is a 12-mark question asking you to explain why there are changes over a time period. It's really important to answer this question well that you know what happens when in terms of crimes and in terms of punishments. Specific dates obviously are brilliant to know, but if you can categorise them into certain time periods, you stand a really good chance of answering this question well. The exam board tends to prefer to use dates in this period of questions, but you don't be surprised if you see medieval period or present day. The dates that they like to use are the following ones. So 1000 round to 1500, which is Anglo-Saxon pre-conquest, through to the reign of Henry VII. The next time period is 1500 to 1700. This is your Tudor and Stuart period, including the English Civil War. The next period is 1700 to 1900, which we could classify as pretty much the Industrial Revolution. And 1900 to the present day. So effectively 20th century. These are the key periods they want you to look at. They're going to ask you why there are changes in a variety of things. They can have a look at things such as law enforcement. This is how criminals are caught. And upholding the laws. They could ask you to look at punishment. It's a bit of a no-brainer really, because obviously the topic is crime and punishment. Remember, punishment is to do with people who have been found guilty. They can ask you to have a look at criminal activity. Or crimes. They could ask you about definitions. As in, how are the crimes interpreted? They could ask you also, potentially, society's attitudes. Towards crime or punishment. The key thing is to know what's going on here. So if, for example, they were asking you about changes in definitions of crime in the 1900s to the present day, you would be thinking along the lines of things such as, for example, changes in the way that people have viewed gender and sexuality. So, for example, decriminalisation of homosexuality, decriminalisation of abortion, the giving of women's rights within things such as marriage. If you're talking about perhaps the nature of law enforcement over a period, say 1500 to 1700, you're going to be looking at not only, to a certain extent, what the changes are, but what's driving the changes. So this brings us to the next point. This is the question of why. Lots of people answering this question don't answer why, they answer how. How is not the same thing. Why is the reason for the change. How is the nature of the change. You may want to talk about how in an effort to get you to why. But how is not the answer to the question here. So if, for example, the question was, for example, the changes to punishment in 1500 to 1700. If you said, well, it started off that people used to be whipped and then people started to be hanged instead for everything, it's right to a certain extent, but it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't explain why this change happens. So if you think about it, you have got the change, whatever this is going to be. And the change is part of a process from the starting position to the end position. So if you like, A to B. That's the change. At the same time, you have to explain the reason for the change. This is really important. I'll just move that up because I'm aware you can't see that. So you have to explain the reason for the change. Remember, of course, that the simple way to answer this question is going to be the use of the Doro technique. The Doro technique is the method that is going to save your bacon. So, what do we mean? Well, it's quite straightforward. We need to name it. We need to describe it. And we need to explain it. This is your factor, or in this case, the change. Describe it is the what happens, if you like, the how, and the explain it is that critical why. Remember, you need 1, 2, 3 in order to get the marks. Ideally, you want to have at least 2 examples. And they've got to come together to answer the question. Let's see how this works out. So, the question we've decided we're going to have a go at is explain why there were changes in the nature of law enforcement in the period 1700 to 1900. Well, first things that we can possibly have a think about are, what are those changes? What are the changes? Well, we know that we have the introduction of the police, in particular the Metropolitan Police. We know that we have got the use of greater technology. And another nature in the nature of law enforcement in this period. Well, this is where it starts to get tricky. We need to think possibly of some other changes that have happened in this section. Well, we have greater use of prisons. Does that include law enforcement? Well, to a certain extent, it's punishment, isn't it, a prison? But having prisons means that potentially you could go and apprehend people for different crimes. So maybe we could argue prisons as a means of changing attitudes to law enforcement. This is a bit ropey, this one. We'll put a little question mark next to that one. Obviously, we've got things like the Bow Street Runners. What else have we got? Well, we've got industrialisation, haven't we, in this period? And industrialisation leads to growth of towns. And growth of towns means higher concentrations of people. Oh, pardon me. I have a wobbly table. Okay, these are changes. Does it, though, explain why there are changes? I mean, we could put the police, if we're thinking about our Doro grid, we could put police as a factor, we could put use of greater tech, perhaps prisons, Bow Street Runners. But then what are the examples going to be? What is the reason why we're getting the growth in the police? What is the reason why we're getting a greater use of tech? What is the reason why we are having things like the Bow Street Runners? Well, this certainly is going to be a key thing. So if we're thinking about our Doros, we might want to put industrialisation as a number one. So let's put that there, industrialisation. Let's park that for a second. Right, what else could we be thinking? Well, greater use of technology. Could we turn that on its head and make it into a heading? Technological advances. Let's change that. Okay. What else could we have? Why else would there have been a need for changes to law enforcement? Well, we've talked about industrialisation here leading to the growth of towns and high concentrations of people. One of the knock-on effects of industrialisation is, of course, poverty. And if we're ever stuck, we can always turn to poverty as a driving factor for change in crime and punishment. So let's have poverty. Right, let's grid this up. So, taking what we've said before, we are going to have industrialisation as one of our factors. We're going to have technological advances as a second of our factors. And we're going to have poverty as the third of our factors. Right, industrialisation. Well, how does this, and remember we're looking at the issue of nature of law enforcement. How does industrialisation impact on this? Well, industrialisation means that we have got a growth in towns, which means more people in smaller areas. One of the other things that we've got in this period, obviously with the Industrial Revolution, is groups of people being effectively disenfranchised from industry. So we have outbreaks of violence against mechanisation. So things like the Luddites, the swing riots, in the 1830s. Luddites went around smashing up machinery. The swing riots were farm groups under Captain Swing, or General Swing, who went around destroying farm equipment in an effort to reduce dependency on mechanical means, which obviously put lots of people out of jobs. The third one, obviously, with industrialisation, which might change the nature of our law enforcement, is, of course, that there is an increase in things worth stealing. What we would call movable goods. If you think about your home today, and you think about the average home back in about 1500, there is an awful lot of things in your house that are quite easy to pinch that wouldn't have existed in 1500. And the same is true in 1700 to 1900. Increasing industrialisation means people have items that are worth stealing. A bit of the old tea there. Technological advances are going to be next. But before we go on to that, it might be worth, and I find it easiest to do it going across, you might find it easier to go this way, to do the explain. So let's do the explain. So we need to say how this and this join together to explain the change in the nature of law enforcement. So the explanation is going to be this. Increased population required new methods to catch criminals. So, for example, the old method of watchmen and constables becomes police. More opportunities for theft means more people required in law enforcement. Let's put that as theft and damage, and then we have a look. Have we answered that? Yes, we have. Yeah, we talked about that, and we've talked about that there. Good. Right, we've covered that. Let's have a look at technological advances. Well, we can't talk about things like fingerprinting because that system comes in very late at the end, but isn't actually used until after 1900. But let's put that in. Let's put things like development of new forensic techniques. Or put even though fingerprinting is just out of period. It's obviously been worked on in the late 1890s, but isn't officially used until 1901. Technological advances. What else have we got? Well, we've got things like the growth of railways and roads, which leads to things like highwaymen. I became a highwayman, was daylight robbery. So, that's a new crime, which is going to need to change law enforcement. It also means, of course, people can move. Can we think of anything else in terms of technological advances? That will change the nature of law enforcement. Technological advances. I mean, we could have something like, for example, the growth of street lighting. We could have an increase in the use of banks, for example. Let's have a look at that. So let's put technological advances. Let's have centralisation of money in banks, which of course leads to the growth of things like bank robbery in the 1800s. Which is going to lead to bank heists. Right, let's have a look at the explanation for this one. So, technological advances change the nature of law enforcement. So, this is going to be the development of dear oh dear, I haven't had enough tea this morning. Forensic detection or detective work. So things like CID. Criminal Investigation Department. And that happens because of new tech and new crimes emerging, e.g. bank robbery. We have things like highwaymen lead to joined up law enforcement, because it's no good, for example, you being a highwayman outside London and then you can run down to Exeter and they have no idea. And to a certain extent, this is where we get the emergence of the Bow Street runners, who are tasked with hunting people down and bringing them back to justice in London. Poverty. Well, so remember, if it links together in terms of your examples or explanations, this is a sign you've got a strong argument. Well, poverty is driven by industrialisation. So industrialisation leads to poor workers in towns because they're paid very little. They're dependent on work in factories. If they can't work in factories, for example, they've been injured, then they're going to be out of their houses. If they're out of their houses, they're going to be homeless. If they're going to be homeless, they're going to need to steal. Population growth. Means that food becomes more expensive. And if you're already poor and struggling to make ends meet and suddenly the price of things like bread goes up, you're going to be really rather stuffed. The last one, of course, if we think about it now, although, as I said, questions 3, 4, 5 and 6 aren't connected with Whitechapel, there's no reason that you can't use your knowledge of Whitechapel if it fits in the time period. And Whitechapel, remember, of course, is 1880s. This fits in our time period, so we can think about, well, what's society like in Whitechapel, where we end up with overcrowded slums. And they become difficult to police. So we've said that is more theft. That is more theft. And this one is going to lead to the rise of things like vigilance committees, like we see in Whitechapel, Mr. Lusk. Or the fact that we get no-go areas for the police. That effectively you end up with these pockets of urban areas, particularly in London, where the police just don't go. Areas that become known as, for example, darkest London. So, why does this lead to the change in law enforcement? Well, more theft means that you need a new system. For example, the bloody code doesn't work. People started to be let off for the lower crimes of stealing. Transportation, which actually in this period changes between America and Australia. But you need a new system, realistically. You don't want to have a situation where people are stealing and then the police or investigation that takes place after the fact, particularly because obviously people are stealing food. And if people are stealing food, they're going to eat it, so you're not going to get the property back. It's not like, for example, I decide to go and steal your television. You come round my house, you'll find I've got your very nice television. The other bit, of course, is that traditional policing methods, I'll move this up a bit because I think you probably can't see so well. Traditional methods of the watchman don't work in slum areas. That's why we lead to police, and even they struggle, which leads to vigilance committees. That little thing there, that is effectively your essay. It's your job to simply stitch it together. If we look at each part in turn, we've named a reason why. We're going to give some examples of how. We're going to come back and explain why, how this answers the question. So, one reason for the change in law enforcement, technological advances. These were things such as the development of new forensic techniques, such as the move towards fingerprinting, the use of bloodhounds, the idea of constructing criminal investigation units. Technological advances such as the growth of railways and roads led to opportunities for highwaymen on roads, and on railways led to the opportunity for train robberies. It also enabled people to be able to move between areas, so criminals could operate in more than one area. The centralisation of money in banks in this period changed the nature of crime away from things like trying to rob travellers to potentially targeting central areas of money, targeting businesses. Explaining why. The development of forensic detective work is because of new tech and new crimes emerging. Highwaymen leads to joined up law enforcement as a result. People like the Bow Street Runners emerge. This means that the nature of law enforcement in this period changes because it is a response to developing crimes and adapting to new technologies enabled to solve crimes and enforce the law. Notice we are using this law enforcement phrase again and again and again. Try